Alright, I promised a TUF review video, and I'm going to do it. And having a bad hair day. That little tuft there that will not go away. Alrighty, so basically, I'm not going to really so much review the fights because a lot of them were just highlight reels. I'm going to talk about them briefly as I go through each fighter and their chances to win, in my opinion. So let's start with the first main one on the night. That would be Jamie Yeager. Bit of an unproven fighter. He's 2-1 with one DQ loss and a pair of strikeage stoppages. One was a KO, one was a doctor stoppage. He's very unproven. I've seen some of his fights, but you can't really gauge much off them because I don't know the guys he's fighting, and they don't have great records. That being said, he apparently has a ground game. Haven't really seen it. He has power in his head kicks, probably also in his hands. He's one of the bigger middleweights, so he's got a chance, and he's a definite prospect, like for the future of the UFC. But I don't rate him highly in terms of winning this particular season. He may win some fights though. Brad Tavares, 4-0, trains with Team Tompkins. He's got good striking. He's reasonably sized at the weight class. Hasn't beaten anyone in terms of solid fighters. He does have a bit of a ground game. He does have some decent wrestling. He's kind of in the same boat as Yeager. He's a guy that I definitely see someday making the UFC and doing something. It's just I don't think he's ready yet. And that was the theme, I think, of this season, was there's a lot of guys that definitely could go far but aren't there yet. Next was Chris the Savage McRae. Chris McRae beat Kleber and Walker with the dislocated shoulder. He's 5-0. Again, no real notable wins. More of a submission artist, but it's more of a brute force submission style. If you look at his fights, he's not the smooth transition kind of guy. He's the kind of guy that takes you down and then just basically clamps onto something until you tap. And there are advantages to that. Again, he's a bit raw. His stand-up needs some work. But, we'll see. We didn't even really get enough to see him in his fight to really judge him all that well. But, again, he's a guy that could surprise me. But he's a guy that wasn't on my radar before this show. That's basically what we keep getting here. James Hammertree, I think this is one of the weaker fighters in the house. I think he probably would have lost to Norman Parisi if Norman Parisi wasn't so mentally weak. He has one notable opponent, that being John Salter, who beat him. John Salter making his UFC debut soon. Aside from that, he has wins over Cans. He doesn't overly impress me in any of the fights. I saw his fight with Salter. He didn't look that good. I think he got lucky on who he was matched up with, and that's how he got in the house. But I think he's somewhere near the bottom. With the Canadian Nick Ring, notable wins include Ishiro Gonzalez. Not really a notable win, but it's a guy who pops up on a lot of records as beating people, so I'm including him for a change. He also has a win over Bill Mahood, a somewhat known fighter, Alex Gasson, but not a very good one. Nonetheless, he was a guy who was actually on the radar. Pretty solid ground game, pretty solid wrestling by Canadian standards anyways. He's got, he's a guy that you can put on his back and he will reverse you, and he kind of showed that in his fight with, who was it? It was Woody Weatherby. He's, I think, one of my favorites to win the show. He's a veteran at 10-0. He's been in there with, some seasoned guys. He's not a guy that I was thinking of a UFC radar, but he was a guy who I'd seen fight a number of times, and a guy who I think has a lot of technical skills that, with the proper coaching, could definitely be a threat to win this show. Kyle Noak, this is my pick to win the show 16-4-1. Just more losses than most guys have, but his losses are to Scott Smith, George Soteropoulos, and two veterans of the game in Japan. I'm not even going to try and say their names. They're not guys you would really know, but they've been around a long time. He has wins over housemate Kaisi Escola, He also has wins over George Sauropoulos of the UFC, Brian Ebersol, which is a decent fight. He has a draw with Hector Lombard, and a victory over Seth Kleinbeck, which I think would be his biggest win to date. Um, he's the guy that I think has the best chance to win this. He's got good wrestling. He's got excellent stand-up. He's got good ground game. You look at his fight with Scott Smith. He was beating up Scott Smith before he got knocked out, which is what Scott Smith does, so there's really no shame in that. He was the guy who was definitively on the UFC radar for me, like a guy who was kind of waiting to see him come into the UFC from Strikeforce. I do believe he left Strikeforce, actually. Yes, or it was Elite XC he was in, so when they closed, he was without a top flight ride, so to speak. So Kyle Noak, that's my pick to win. Um, yeah, I have a hard time seeing who would beat him, but we'll see. Court McGee, this is another pretty good wrestler. He has a couple of notable wins over Ishiro Gonzalez, Nick Rossborough, who's a former UFC tough competitor, and of course current UFC man, Demarcus Johnson. His lone loss is to Jeremy Horn. No shame in that. He's got very solid wrestling. He's got pretty good stand-up. He's a tough bastard. Um, he's another guy that I think could win this. I got him up there basically with Nick Ring, with Kyle Noak as like guys to beat this season. He also beat Seth Bakachinsky, who's a pretty decent fighter himself, to get into the house. Chris Camozzi showed a lot of heart, but not a lot of technique in his victory over crap. Victor O'Donnell, breaking his eye socket. Got a lot of power, so he's a threat just on that level. He's got some wrestling, some ground game. He's a guy who can get himself out of trouble. He's got a lot of physical attributes that you want in a fighter, but I just don't think he's quite seasoned to the level yet, which is surprising because he's a 12-3 fighter. His losses are all to reasonably notable competition. Jesse Taylor, Jesse Forbes, both of UFC fame. Nick Rossborough popping up again as a former tough competitor. He has two notable wins though. He did beat Donnie Lyles, who was a star in the IFL, and a guy that I kind of surprised has never gotten his UFC shot, and former UFC fighter Chad Reiner. So he's got some decent wins.